We're going to be adding and subtracting fractions and decimals. The first one is adding two fractions. This is a little bit easier because we have a common denominator. Whenever the denominators are the same, we keep the denominator the same. We're not adding them. Notice that the denominator stays as 7. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add the numerator. 2 plus 3 is 5. Now for the second one, it's a little bit more difficult because the denominators are not the same. In order to add or subtract fractions, we need a common denominator. In this case, our common denominator when we have 8 and 4 would be 8. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that our second fraction has a denominator of 8. In order to do that, I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom by 2. So I have 7/8. I'm keeping this the same because my 8 is my common denominator. 3 times 2 is 6. 4 times 2 is 8. And since my denominators are the same, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract them. Remember, the denominator stays the same, so it stays as 8. And when I subtract the numerators, 7 minus 6 gives me a 1. Now with our third one, even though it's a mixed number, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to look for a common denominator. Our common denominator is what they both can go into. 7 and 6 would be 42. So that means I want a denominator of 42. Now, in order to make the 7 of 42, I have to multiply it by 6. So that means we have a 6 on top. In order to make a 6 of 42, I have to multiply it by 7. So 5 times 7 is 35. Now I'm going to add the two different mixed numbers. I'm going to add the 1 and the 4, and that gives me a 5. I'm going to add the 6 and the 35, and that gives me a 41. What I want you to do is pause the video for a second and try those next three on your own. Looking at our next one, our common denominator is going to be 20. So we're going to multiply the first one by 5. And we're going to multiply the second one by 4. And then when we add them up, remember the denominator stays the same. And when we add our numerator, 5 plus 12 is 17. For the next one, it's a little bit more complicated. What we need to do is we need to figure out a common denominator for 12 and 15. There's a few different ways of doing it. One is to write out all the different multiples of 12 and all the different multiples of 15. So 12, 24, 36, 48, 60. For 15, it's 15, 30, 45, and 60. So we see that they both have a 60 in common. So that right there would be a common denominator of 60. That's one way of figuring out the common denominator. The other one is a factor tree. That takes a little bit more work, so we're just going to focus on finding multiples. Now, when we're looking at our first one, 12 goes into 65 times. So that means that I'm going to multiply my first fraction by 5. And 15 goes into 64 times. So I'm going to multiply my second one by 4. 5 times 7 is 35. 2 times 4 is 8. So when I subtract it, remember the denominator stays the same. 35 minus 8 is 27. Now looking at the third one, we have mixed numbers. This time we're going to be subtracting the mixed numbers. But once again, what we want to do is we want to find the common denominator. So a number that both 8 and 10 go into, 8, 16, 24, 32, 40, 10, 20, 30, 40. So we see that they both go into 40. Now some of you probably already knew that. So you can just put the 40 right away. You don't have to show the work. Now 8 goes into 45 times. So that means that we need to multiply by 5. 7 times 5 is 35. 10 goes into 44 times. So I'm going to multiply it by 4. 3 times 4 is 12. Now I'm subtracting it this time. So when I subtract it, I subtract the 3 minus the 1, which gives me a 2. And the 35 minus the 12, which gives me a 23. That right there would be adding and subtracting fractions. Now we're going to move to the decimals. The key for the decimals is the actual decimal. And what you have to do is you have to remember to line up the decimals. So we have 1.73 plus 6.1. I put a 0 as a placeholder, and then I'm going to add them up. 3 plus 0 is 3. 7 plus 1 is 8. 1 plus 6 is 7. Looking at the second one, I have 5.3. I'm going to minus 3.11. Notice I'm lining up the decimals. I'm going to add a 0 as a placeholder. And when I subtract them, I'm going to have to borrow. So this becomes a 10 and the 3 becomes a 2. 10 minus 1 is 9. 2 minus 1 is 1. 5 minus 3 is 2. So we have 2.19. Now, if we're looking at the next one, once again, I'm going to line up the decimals. 52.4, 8.93. Once again, I'm going to put a 0 for the placeholder. I'm going to borrow from the 4. So what we have is 10 minus 3, which is 7. Then I have to borrow from the 2, and that gives me 13. 13 minus 9 is 4. Then I have to borrow from the 5. I get 11. 11 minus 8 is 3. So I have 43.47. What I want you to do is pause the video for a second and try the next 3 on your own. Okay, let's look at our last 3. We don't have a decimal for 432, so if we don't have one, we know it's at the end. So it would be 432, and then we would have 9.01. Once again, I'm going to put placeholders. I'm going to borrow from the 2, so this becomes a 1, and then we have 9 and 10. So we have 9, 9. Then I have to borrow from the 3 to make the 1 and 11. I have 2, and then what I have is 4. So I have 40. Let's see. Oops, forgot that. So I forgot to bring down that 2. So I have 422.99. Looking at the next one, I'm going to line up the decimals. 5.31, 74.6. I'm going to put 0 as a placeholder. When I add them up, I get 1, 9, 9, and 7. So I have 79.91. And for the next one, I'm going to add them up. I have 6.88. I have 90. Remember, if we don't see a decimal, we know that it's at the end. So this would be 0.00. When I add it up, I have 88.96.